Hi, this is Advait here. If you're watching this video, you're going to watch me take a full ACT science section in real time. While I do this, I hope that observing the strategies I use to handle this section will hopefully give you a better idea of how to handle it as well. Before I start doing this, I'm going to talk about the ACT science section and give an overview of my strategies. So, as you know, science is the last section of the ACT and it is 35 minutes long for 40 questions. Just like every section of the ACT, it is fast-paced, and you have to keep moving and manage your time well in order to get a high score. In order to manage your time well, you need to know how long to spend on each set of questions. In this video, I will be using the term passage a lot to refer to each text along with its charts and graphs, as well as the set of questions that accompany that text and charts and graphs. So, there are 6 passages on the ACT science section. Now, technically, before 2016, there used to be 7 passages, but since then there have always been 6. Now, there are 3 types of passages on the ACT science section: data representation, research summary, and conflicting viewpoints. Let me talk about the difference between these 3 types of passages. So the data representation passage tends to be the simplest type of passage because it contains mostly charts and graphs and it contains the least text of all the types of passages. There are 2 data representation passages per science section, and a data representation passage is always accompanied by exactly 6 questions. So if you're given a passage and you don't really know what type it is, look at how many questions follow. If there are 6 questions that follow, it's a data representation passage. So what it does is it represents data, but it does not explain the procedures by which or the purpose for which that data was obtained. So that's what research summary, which is the next type of passage, that's what research summary passages do. They explain the procedures as well as the purpose for that data. But data representation passages, all they do is present it. So the best method for handling these types of the data representation passage is to go straight to the questions. I know many other teachers will tell you to go straight to the questions in general in the ACT science section. This is especially true for the data representation passage. It's less true for the other 2, research summary and conflicting viewpoints, and I'll get to that. As far as time management, it's best to spend a maximum of 5 minutes answering this passage's questions. Now, if you finish early, if you finish in like 4 minutes, because sometimes data representation passages aren't that hard, they're pretty easy, and you finish early in like 4 minutes, you could spend 6 minutes on a later data representation passage if you really need to. So this 5-minute thing is not totally strict. However, there are 2 data representation passages, and you should spend a total of 10 minutes on both, at a maximum of 10 minutes on them. Sometimes both data representation passages will be easy, and maybe you can finish in 8 or 9 minutes. Anyway, for the next type of passage. So, research summary passages. So, it's more complex than the data representation passage, as I slightly touched on. There are 3 research summary passages per science section, and each one contains exactly 7 questions. So once again, if you're not sure what type of passage it is, look at the number of questions that follow, and if it's 7. Now, actually, conflicting viewpoints passages, which are the next type I'm going to talk about, those also contain 7 questions. So let me explain the difference between research summary and conflicting viewpoints. So it's always accompanied by 7 questions. The purpose of this passage is to what it does is it explains the purpose and the procedures of one or more experiments. And you may be asked about these, about the procedures of the experiment or the purpose of the experiment, in addition to presenting the data collected from it, just like in the data representation passage. But this passage contains more text than the data representation passage. So it's more complex than it. As far as how the method to handle this passage, you can go straight to the questions. However, I only recommend you do this if it only contains one experiment or study. However, usually it will contain more than one experiment or study, maybe like 2 or 3. And if it does this, what I recommend you do is find the difference between them. Sometimes 2 experiments may have charts that look exactly the same, that have the exact same variables, but there's like a description of the chart before the chart is presented, and maybe briefly look over those descriptions to see what the difference is. Sometimes the charts will look very similar, but in one chart, one variable is being held constant, whereas in the other chart, another variable is being held constant. So those are things you want to look out for. Maybe going straight to the questions will work for you then as well. It honestly depends. I find that if I don't understand the difference between the experiments at first, I'll get kind of confused when a question requires me to understand the difference. Like when I read a later question that requires me to understand the difference. So I just go ahead and knock that off right as I start the passage. And you should spend a maximum of 6 minutes answering this passage's questions. Like with data representation passage, if you finish, you may be able to finish one early in like 5 minutes, and that will make up for another one that takes like 7 minutes to do. So it's up to you. If you feel like if you finish in 5 minutes and you feel like you can take an extra minute to check your work, you can. I don't recommend doing that because that minute is it's much more worthy spent on a later, harder research summary passage. So now let me talk about the conflicting viewpoints. So the conflicting viewpoints passage is generally considered to be the hardest passage of the 3 types, because it contains the least charts and graphs and it contains the most text. There's only one of these per test, and it's usually advised to save this for last because it's the most different of all of them. Like the other 2, data representation and research summary, they mostly rely on reading graphs, although you may have to read a bit, whereas this one is different. There are usually like no graphs, maybe like very few. And there's a method to this that you don't really use for the other 2 types. It's also accompanied by exactly 7 questions like the research summary, but the difference is what it does, what it tests. So here's a good description of this passage. It describes a scientific phenomenon first, and then presents 2 or more explanations for this phenomenon, and these explanations often conflict with each other. So the best method to handling this passage is, and also there may be, like I said, 2 or more. There's usually a minimum of 2 explanations, but a maximum of 4. I've only seen up to 4 explanations. And even though it may seem like a lot to read like 4 different explanations for a phenomenon, usually it doesn't take that much more time than if there were 2, because usually 2 explanations are the same in every respect except one, and it indicates that. I don't want to confuse you by getting too in-depth with that. You'll probably see it on a test, and when you do, it's pretty simple to understand. Anyway, the best method to handling this is to read before answering the questions. So for this one, you do not go straight to the questions. Don't consider going straight to the questions. It will probably not be efficient. You should read the viewpoints before answering the questions. And when you read the viewpoints, try to note what is unique to each viewpoint and note the key differences between them as well, which the questions love to test. They love to test certain aspects that are unique to only certain viewpoints, and as well as key differences between 2 of them, and similarities, of course. So an example of this is maybe usually the viewpoints are presented in terms of like scientists or students, like scientist 1, scientist 2, scientist 3, or student 1, student 2, student 3. Let's say scientist 1 says that there's oxygen involved, whereas scientist 2 says that there is no oxygen involved. That is something to take note of. And let's say that scientist 3 is the only one that says nitrogen is involved, and scientists 1 and 2 don't say anything about that. That's something you need to keep note of. Try to save up 7 minutes for this passage. Some people will say you need 10 minutes. I don't think you need 10 minutes for this. I think 7 is just fine. Let me go to the final page. So this is the total breakdown of the passages, how many questions you'll be doing, and in how many minutes. So the data representation passages cover 12 questions, and you should spend a total of 10 minutes for them. The research summary passages cover a total of 21 questions, and you should spend 18 minutes for them at most. You can spend less if you manage to be able to. And then the conflicting viewpoints passage, there's only one, so it's just 7 questions, and you should spend 7 minutes. This adds up to exactly 35 minutes. So yeah, this doesn't give you a whole lot of wiggle room, so you have to work fast and you have to work continuously. And you should try to stick to these time limits as much as you can. If you find that for one research summary passage, 6 minutes go by and you haven't answered all the questions, come back to it, go to another passage. Maybe you'll have time to do it at the end once you've done it, but even if you don't, just guess on it. Chances are that time that you spent doing those hard few questions on that research summary passage, it was better spent doing some easier questions on a later passage. Anyway, this is basically an overview of how I think of the science section, and I'm going to take a full ACT science test in front of you. I'm going to be pausing the timer just to explain a few things about how I think, as well as I'm just going to pause the timer after I finish a passage and move on to another one. Anyway, moving on.